All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Um, I'll start sharing my screen here. All right, let me know when you can see it.
I can see it.
So I think most of you have been part of these, but if you haven't, this is doing some liquids training, I guess we're calling it. And this is kind of a part of a series, part 3 or 4 of that series. And what we're really looking at doing is building up from kind of from a foundation of the first few sessions went over like a mass balance of a system, how is sludge produced and secondary systems like WAS. How do we think about that sludge produced or that sludge yield? And then how are we controlling that sludge wasted? And that's what we talked about wasting last time. So we'll go over and do a little bit of recap on that. And then today's session for the most of the second half is going to be on typical activated sludge troubleshooting. So we're going to go over troubleshooting approaches, and that's where the quizzes will start getting involved to see. And that's where we'll ask that you have your phone out and kind of participate individually on the quizzes. So we'll keep going here. So the agenda today is really that recap on solids produced. Uh, we'll have a game on typical activated sludge problems. Activated sludge doesn't look right. What are some of the causes and what are some of the solutions? Um, and then if we have time, we'll get into what drives SRT selection. But in the other sessions, we haven't had time. We've ended before that, so that'll be part of a subsequent session then. So as we go through and we look at typical activated sludge process components, what we've been really focusing on the past few sessions is kind of just the mass balance around this activated sludge system. Um, and when we really look at it, we started talking about the raw influent or primary effluent, whatever's really feeding your system. And that's where we focused a lot on that substrate or that food coming into the system. And thinking about that mass balance. So that mass balance of how does it transform as it goes through the system? How do we get to our effluent? And then really what we focused on was this kind of intersection here, and um, how are we controlling our RAS and our WAS, and what is really ultimately controlling that WAS flow and WAS pounds wasted every day. Um, so just a quick recap on that. How are solids produced? How do we grow bugs and how do they reproduce? So really, again, we're starting with that BOD or that food. So if you ever hear the term substrate, really what they're talking about is the food of the system or the BOD in this case. So BOD is what really drives our sludge production. So we grow nitrifiers, and those nitrifiers are part of that sludge, but really the BOD is what really drives the amount of wasting we have. We produce the most amount of bugs, the most amount of mass off of BOD. So our bacteria are taking that BOD. They're able to take it and use it and convert it to energy essentially. So that with that energy, similar to what we would do, they're using it to maintain their bodies, right? Similar to how we maintain our bodies by intake of food. They're able to do the same thing, and they're performing cell maintenance. So the first thing they're doing with energy is performing cell maintenance to make sure that they can survive. And then with enough energy, basically what they do is they do something called synthesis. So that's where they reproduce more cells. So if we have a system that's at the appropriate F to M, where bacteria have enough food, they're going to reproduce more cells. So you basically have a continuous fresh population or a younger population. Um, Now, if we don't have enough food and we don't have enough energy, what bacteria are going to start doing is they're not going to start producing new cells. They're going to use any energy they have um, to really start to do the maintenance. And then if they don't have enough energy further, that's where you start to see decay. And you see basically like bacteria will start basically consuming other bacteria. We'll have kind of endogenous decay where we're breaking apart that system and we're decaying bugs rather than producing new bugs. And when we think about this, we keep using the term biomass yield. And if that's kind of a confusing term, it really means is biosolids production. So I'm talking if you hear the term yield, what we're talking about is production. And what we went over in the last few sessions, it was really just how we have a system where we have BOD coming in, these big yellow circles coming into our system, and we have our bacteria at the beginning of that system, the green circles here. And as we go through the system, we're basically consuming all the yellow, and we're ending up growing bacteria. So if we think about our BOD coming into our system, generally by the time we have maybe primary treatment, that BOD is soluble. And so if we didn't do this step and we just tried to settle it out, it doesn't settle. So what we're doing with the step in the aeration basin is we're taking BOD and we're making that BOD settleable. So now we can settle it out in a clarifier. And to make it settleable, basically what we're doing is we're using the BOD to grow bacteria, and that bacteria is then settleable. So that's kind of when you think about how we're converting BOD and transforming BOD, what we're really doing is we're trying to find a way to remove it. We don't have to grow bacteria, but bacteria is the easiest way that we can remove it, and then we can settle those bacteria out and we can waste them. Um, And then when we think about this observed yield or this solids production, what we get into is this observed yield down here. And it's something we can calculate and estimate. And you can trend it in your system to see how much waste you're actually producing. So this is where we get into this equation here, which is our yield equation, which you can calculate basically your pounds of VSS produced per day based on how many pounds you're feeding it per day. And that typical yield of that system like that is around 0.6. Now each system will see higher or lower depending on whether you have primary treatment or the type of BOD you have coming in. But generally that 0.6 is usually a rough average. Um, and when we think about that, so if I have 10 pounds of BOD coming in, what that means is out of that 10 pounds of BOD, I'm going to produce 6 pounds of VSS. And with that VSS, once I figure out my VSS, I can then take that times my VSS to TSS ratio of my tip
Hello,
of my
sir, you can
system
allow
that's
to
typical. Um, so as we kind of go forward, this is one way you can work on. You can really look at your system, your mass balance, and determine if the balance you have going on and the yield, the sludge yield you have, is really making sense and it's trending with what numbers you know. And if it's not, then you can start to question, okay, well, is one of my samples off? So this is what allows you to kind of get in that frame of mind to figure out where should I be based on a typical number and why am I not close to that? So now sludge production basics. So just kind of taking it all and putting it together. Really we have a change. Like if we're thinking about how we're going through our daily, like if we're going through this each morning, we're thinking about, okay, an influent loading change. Maybe that changed my mixed liquor. So my mixed liquor increased or decreased. So I'm taking that new mixed liquor value and I'm inputting it into my SRT equation. So that's where I'm determining what length of time I'm targeting for my SRT, whether I'm targeting 10 days or 11 days, um, and what do I need to do next? And that's where basically I say, hey, I'm going to change the amount of time. And I'm going to adjust the SRT or I'm going to adjust the wasting. And that way I'm getting back to my target that I'm doing in that system. And this is something that you really each plant should be doing on a daily basis. And in my mind, it should be something that you start at the beginning of a shift. So whether that's the 8 a.m. shift, they're starting, they're saying, hey, we looked at the numbers over the past 24 hours. Here's the numbers are showing. We're going to keep the same wasting as yesterday, or we're going to adjust wasting by 5% up or down today. And then throughout the rest of that day, what you're doing is you've set that target and all your operators are working towards a common target. And so that's why I think it's a good thing to So think about a routine. What's your plant's routine? Are we setting those? Are we grabbing those samples, getting those samples by 8 a.m. and we're all looking at the numbers and we're making a decision and setting a target? That way, by 9 a.m., everybody knows what that target is for the rest of the day. So really, a lot of you have trends in your system. So just using trends to make some of those operational decisions. And generally, at most, we really want to only make one WAS pumping adjustment per day. On a typical day, we want to work on trying to achieve those targets. And for those facilities that waste 24/7, that's something that, you're basically setting the pump at your pump flow rate for 24 hours and you don't have to make any adjustments. There are some facilities at TRA that basically aren't wasting 24/7. And so they're basically having to look at the number of hours they're going to pump versus their pump flow rate. And so that requires a little more calculation, but just making sure that you're following through with it and checking your hours that you actually wasted that day. Unless you're way off and you know your SRT is 5 or 10 days off, if you're making an adjustment, wait and observe for 2 or 3 days. Keep wasting over those 2 or 3 days. Keep wasting at that same rate. But generally, the rule of thumb we use to turn over a biomass population is 2 to 3 SRTs. So if we've made an operational change, so if that operational change is DO or SRT, if we've made that a DO change or an SRT shift, we may have made that shift today and we observed it over the next 2 or 3 days. But really to turn over a biomass, if your change was large enough, it really takes 2 to 3 SRTs before that change is kind of fully, you have a population that's adapted to that environment. And so for an example on that, so if Cruise runs a low DO system, so if Cruise started up their plant and they're running a 2 milligram per liter DO throughout the basin, and they wanted to get back to where they're operating now with a lower DO, as they make those changes, it's going to take time. So if they're making that change, they're going down to low DO, they're going to have to go down slowly. And then as they get down there, if they're running a 10-day SRT, for instance, it's going to take 20 to 30 days for that new population to really take over. So during those 20 to 30 days, that's where you've got to take your time, you've got to take samples and make sure that you don't have any process upsets and that you're maintaining process performance because you're basically selecting for new nitrifiers. And the same thing can be said if I'm going from, so that example was going from a DO of 2 to maybe a DO of 0.5 with some steps in the middle. But if I'm going from maybe an SRT of 20 to 10, I'm still going to have to do that same thing. I'm going to have to basically be consistent about it. And for that first part of that, you're going to have a shift in populations. And then as you get to 20 to 30 days out, you're going to start to see that system start to stabilize, depending on what your target is. And then, if you're kind of in doubt of some of your numbers, keep your WAS flow adjustments to plus or minus 10%. And that way you're not making a huge change. So if I was wasting 10 gallons per minute yesterday, making sure that you're somewhere within the 9 to 11 gallons per minute today. If you're questioning like a mixed liquor sample or a WAS concentration, making that smaller thing, and maybe you're grabbing another sample, or you're looking at samples over the next 24 hours to confirm your numbers that you were questioning. And that kind of really brings up the critical measurements. And so when we look at the critical measurements for our mass balance of our system, like these ones are very critical. Obviously, flows are critical. Making sure you have flow meters that are accurate and you can trust what they're saying. But generally, that's not something within an operator's control. Generally, a flow meter is not in your control. But what is in your control, and this goes all levels of operations, is when you're grabbing those mixed liquors and those RAS and WAS samples, making sure that you're getting a good sample, because these samples are used in calculations. And so if we're getting a bad sample, we can throw off our calculations and make the system so you're making decisions that aren't based on reality. And one thing I would say is like if you're getting a mixed liquor sample, you get that sample back, and the past three samples have been maybe 3,500 milligrams per liter. The sample you just grabbed, you measure, and you get 2,000 milligrams per liter. Now, there's a good chance that you didn't go from 3,500 to 2,000 over one operational shift. And so, the biggest thing is if you're getting that sample, it's either one, think about resampling, or two, record that sample, but maybe make sure that people that are doing the calculations know that, hey, I don't think that sample is very accurate. It seems like it's not trending with the other values. The one thing I would say not to do is don't fake in a number. Don't fake in a number to say, oh, the last guy had 3,500. I'm going to put mine. I got 2,000, but I'm going to put mine at 3,300 because I don't want to put in 2,000 and I don't want to tell anybody. You're not going to like, to me, it's you're learning as you go and you say, well, why is my sample wrong? And you start asking other people, where do you sample at? Making sure you're all doing it consistently. Any questions on just the recap here? Okay, so we're going to go into our game here. So I ask that each of you have your a phone ready, and you're going to basically scan a QR code as we go through it. And so I'll kind of give you the background of it. So the first topic is my activated sludge doesn't look right. So you're going to scan the QR code for each scenario and join the game. And then really once you scan the QR code, you'll be able to follow instructions on the screen, and answer the questions. So the scenarios for today's game, there's 12 total topics. The ones in bold are the ones we highlighted that we're going to cover today. We're not covering all 12 today. So we're going to cover, I have sludge floating to the surface of my clarifiers. I have pin flock going over the secondary clarifier weirs. And I have dark tan foam in my aeration basins. And then lastly, we'll cover my sludge blanket is overflowing. Um, so with the slide deck that we get, you'll have all of these, and these are really based on kind of like an EPA guidelines, activated sludge troubleshooting. So it's generalized guidelines, but it's a very good starting point. It's a very good starting point to make sure you have a good base knowledge of why things are going that way and what are some of the causes and what are some of the solutions for those. And so you'll have all 12 of these in there, and then in later sessions, we'll keep covering more and more of these. So you end up having all of them in your arsenal. So the first one, if you want to scan this QR code, I'll give you a minute here, and then I'm going to go over to the actual page. All right, I'm going to bring up the. Oops. All right, so I see Ray joined. Um, Yeah, I was gonna say, it looks like we have six people joining, so we're getting there. I'll give it another minute or so here, and if you didn't get the scan yet, there's another one on my screen now that you can see on the left-hand side of the screen. We'll wait a little bit longer. It looks like we have 8 people in. 5 of you have joined. And if you don't want to put your name, don't. If you want to be anonymous, just put some fake name in there. Like we have maybe one more, Don Cheadle. Waiting to see who smiled. Nobody smiled. All right, I think we have 8 people. I don't see any other ones that have joined, so we're going to go ahead and start the quiz. When I hit start, you're going to get the first question. And with that first question, you have about 3 minutes. And so the first question, and don't feel pressured. I mean, we're going to answer the questions, and then afterwards, we're going to talk about the answers. So if you don't know, take your best guess at it, and let's talk about why some of these are right and some of these are wrong. All right. think most of you have answers in. We'll give it a little bit here. It looks like there may be one person, but I think somebody might have left, so we'll wait a little bit longer though. All right, somebody with Carl's group. Which one is obviously not a right answer? Which one is for sure wrong?
Carl, you're muted if you guys are talking.
All right. Say again.
Dosing too much
I was gonna
alum.
say, which one of these do you think is obviously definitely wrong?
Dosing too much alum.
Dosing too much alum. Why do you say that?
Uh, doesn't alum help sludge to settle?
Yeah, alum will help sludge settle. You can dose like way too much alum. You typically won't see it though, yeah. So it's not a right answer. The two right answers are there are filamentous organisms in my mixed liquor, and there's denitrification occurring in the secondary blanket. Um, so let's go over some of the other ones here. So let's go over each of these as we go. If we have filamentous organisms in the clarifiers, why is that gonna cause sludge to float to the surface? What are those doing?
Not help let properly settle.
Yeah, if we have too many filaments, basically what happens is it starts creating kind of like umbrellas, and those umbrellas don't settle well, and you end up having some of it float to the surface. What about why is I noticed somebody answered for nitrification. So nitrification occurring in the secondary clarifier blanket. So why might that not happen, or why might it happen, I guess? What do we need to have if we have nitrification?
Need to have air.
We need to have air, and we shouldn't have air in the secondary clarifiers. And that kind of goes to the far right one where my DO levels are too high. Generally, that shouldn't create any issues um, in your blanket. And what actually might help is if you have higher DO coming out of your aeration basin, because then you don't go anaerobic in your clarifiers. And when we talk about going anaerobic, that means we're going to have denitrification in the blankets. So what is denitrification, and why is it a problem in our secondary clarifiers?
When it's stays in the finals too long.
Yeah, and what's getting converted in there?
Uh, Nitrate or nitrogen.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, we're basically taking nitrate and we're making nitrogen gas. And so that nitrate is something that in the aeration basins we've converted our ammonium. We went from ammonium to nitrate in our aeration basins, and now that nitrate enters our clarifiers. And if there's no air present, what's going to happen is we're going to denitrify that nitrate, therefore making nitrogen gas. And that nitrogen gas then lifts up our blanket. Um, how many of you, I think a few of you have been to Paul's training in the spring, where he does like the 6 or 7 beakers at the front, and he doses them with different levels of carbon, and they're all out of the secondary clarifier. And he's waiting to see how long until one of the blankets floats. And so that's really what he's doing there is he's driving denitrification in that blanket to cause it to float. And that's where if you end up seeing some of that, one thing you can check is that you actually have sufficient DO coming out of your aeration basin. That way it doesn't go anoxic or anaerobic in the clarifier. Because if you have DO present, you won't denitrify. Any questions on those? No?
We'll start updating.
All right, we'll go to the next one then. So Don Cheadle is in the lead. And by the way, you get points for answering fast too. So
Good job, Don Cheadle. Oops.
second question. So you've got to drag these to where you think if you have sludge floating into the clarifiers, what can I do?
Go ahead.
Good morning. I'm working on
All right. So we have time up, and it looks like nobody picked anything for denitrification. Interesting. So let's start off with where we're at for I have sludge floating to the surface of my secondary clarifiers. What can I do? So if I have filamentous organisms, one of the answers here is increase SRT. Does anybody want to talk about why increasing SRT? And the other thing I'm going to flip over to is notice over here could work for both is decreasing SRT. So talk about SRT and filaments. Anybody want to take a shot? You're on mute, Carl, if you're talking. So if we think about what causes filaments to grow, there's a lot of causes for filaments, and what we talked about in other sessions is that it may be good to have a session talking about filaments, the different types of filaments and the different environments which they grow. I know Ray, you just came offline. I don't know if you want to talk about SRT.
Yeah, well, I lost, I don't know what happened, but I lost my signal on my cell phone. And
Oh,
anyway, uh, 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 yeah, increase SRT. I think, uh, we need, it might be, that we have some young sludge and we want to retain it more in the system. Or it can be also, again, denitrification. And or it can be the growth of filamentous bacteria for the lack of DO and BOD in the system, the balance.
Yeah, yeah, like there's different types of filaments. It makes filaments tough because
Yeah,
they can grow like there's different conditions which they grow. And so the reason you're seeing SRT up here, you see both increased SRT and then over here you see decreased SRT. So increased SRT would be one way to control filaments. For instance, if you have a high F to M, if your F to M is too high, you're overloading your system. And in
yeah,
those conditions, there's certain filaments that are going to compete at that high F to M. Um, at the same time, there's also you could decrease SRT if you have too low of an F to M. Too low of an F to M also means that there's a filament that can compete at very low concentrations. And so it's just, and this is why we talk about F to Ms, we talk about SRT. It's all trying to find that sweet spot of SRT and F to M so that we don't have an environment where filaments can compete. And
yeah,
even kind of adding on to it, decreasing SRT at some point, decreasing SRT, assuming you don't have a high F to M. If you have a high F to M, that's a different situation. But at some point, you need to decrease some of the SRT because you got to waste some of the filaments out of the system.
yes.
So it's all a balance, though, watching your system. So the next two on the list actually are pH and DO. And so if we think about, um, well, we're going to focus on filaments right now. Right now, we'll talk about denitrification in a second, but there's filaments that are very good at low pHs. So if you have a pH of like 6.6 or 6.7, there's filaments that can compete there. What these filaments are doing is these filaments eat or they use the substrate BOD just like our good bacteria do. So
Yeah,
our bacteria that we want, OHOs, they're competing for the same food. And at these different conditions, they can actually outcompete our good bacteria. And one of those conditions is low DO, and that's low DO. I want to be clear about this though. Low DO conditions and soluble BOD, like VFAs. That's where you have filaments compete. And so if we use cruise as an example, um, if we use cruise as an example, you have your first A1 zone where you sometimes even have the air off, so you have very low DO there. And that A1 zone is after a selector zone though. And what Cruise has noticed is that when they have periods of high loading, they need to take their first zone and they need to increase the airflow. And really, you need to increase the airflow because what's happening is you're having bleed through of your selector zone. So you have VFAs that make it through the selector zone. They don't get used in the selector zone, and they make it through to that first aerobic zone where you have low DO. And what we talked about in the Tuesday session was during those conditions, what Cruise has found is if they increase airflow and increase DO, they're able to kind of manage that and not have settlability in filament growth. And I think you guys have like a rule of thumb now, right, Carl? Like if you start seeing SVI changes, you start increasing the airflow in A1.
Yes, sir.
So the last thing here for filaments, manage up to M was out the bottom. We talked about that, and that's kind of the SRT part. But chlorine and hydrogen peroxide to the RAS. So what are we doing when we add chlorine and hydrogen peroxide to the RAS?
Removing the filaments.
Yeah, how are we removing them though?
As they protrude out and make contact with the chlorine, they die off. And we
Yeah,
try not to mess with the flock.
yeah, and that's a good a good description, Carl. So what Carl said when they protrude out. So filaments generally have they generally have like a longer body. Let's just say that. When you look at it under a microscope, they're gonna have a longer body, meaning they're exposed to more of the water. They have more surface area exposed to the water, and they're more susceptible to being killed with chlorine. Our flocks, or meatballs, as some of you guys call them, the flocks kind of protect themselves. So when you look under a microscope and you have your flock of your good bacteria, that outside of the bacteria is the only thing exposed to the chlorine. And so the outside of the bacteria, you may have some damage to the outside of that, but the inside of that flock is largely protected against the chlorine. And that's what that flock structure helps protect, whether it's flocks or granules, you're protecting the inside of that flock. And so that's where you've really got to be careful of the chlorine or the hydrogen peroxide concentration and making sure you do a low dose, because the high dose ends up killing everything. And so when people talk about chlorinating their RAS, my biggest recommendation for them is start slow. Start slow and look for observations. And some of the observations you're going to see if you've dosed too much is you might start to see pin flock, meaning you've dosed too much and you broke apart that flock. You broke apart the meatball, you killed it. And now in your clarifiers, you're going to see when it gets killed, it just falls apart and it becomes little particles. So now I'm going to talk about denitrification real quick. So denitrification, we talked about all of these that could work for both. If our blanket's floating, specifically to denitrification, why would decreasing SRT help denitrification in the blanket? So if we have a lower SRT, we're going to carry less inventory. And if we have less inventory, we're going to have smaller blankets. And so if we have smaller blankets, then there's less likelihood that we're going to go anaerobic and start denitrifying. The reason increasing DO can work for denitrification is, again, we talked about a little bit, we're making sure we don't have DO going from the aeration basins into the clarifiers. And then increasing RAS rate, that one is really to make sure that instead of having a 5-foot blanket, you have a 1-foot blanket. So again, you're controlling that blanket depth to make sure that it's not going anaerobic and basically denitrifying everything that's in there. All right, let's keep moving. So after that one, Don Cheadle almost got caught by Daniel. Eris Beth's moving up, but Don Cheadle takes the victory. All right, so now we're going to go to let's see, I think we're going to go to the next one. So the next scenario is I have pin flock, so you have to join a new game. So you're going to scan a new barcode. I have pin flock going over my secondary clarifier weirs, but my SVIs are good. So we'll go to this one. Here's the new game. We're waiting for one more and then we'll get going here.
Yeah. Oh. Oh.
All right, I think we have our 8. So we're gonna start our first question. You guys ready? So I have pin flock going over my weirs. What could be a cause?
So I need some wires. So there's too much behavior. But there's behavior. Because that's constant. That's causing, what's causing, what is the error of that time? Yeah. Yeah, so can be doing, like in flock.
All right, here we go. So everybody answered. Looks like we had a pretty good range of answers here. So pin flock. So can somebody describe pin flock for me? How would you describe pin flock?
Just small particles floating on top of the supernate.
Yeah, it's pin flock is when, like, if you go to your clarifiers and you're seeing a blanket and it settles pretty well, but you notice that it's leaving junk behind, right? It's leaving behind these small particles and it's not collecting it. And when you look kind of at the EPA manual, what they really kind of stress in the EPA manual, and we'll talk about, I think generally this is a good starting place to look at. They talk about excessive turbulence and over oxidized sludge in the aeration basins. So what's happening if we kind of are have excessive turbulence or over aerating? We're breaking apart the flocks. That's the theory there. And to me, you've got to have a lot of turbulence to do that. You probably have to have, if anybody's ever seen the surface aerators that are like throwing sludge around, like you've got to have a lot of turbulence. I would say over
It'd be
oxidized
hard to do it
sludge.
with
Yeah.
diffusers, but coarse air, you can get it done.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, that's like the EPA manual, they're looking at a bunch of different plants, a bunch of different conditions. I think fine bubble diffusers, you're gonna have a hard time having excessive turbulence in your system. You're likely looking at a different cause. Overoxidized sludge, high DO, one of the things that, when they say the overoxidized sludge, it's kind of like that you're adding too much air and it's like turbulence, but really the other thing to think about is if you're adding too much air, when you think about your granules and your flocks, you grow nice big flocks and granules because you have different communities living within that flock, right? And some communities like to have a high air or high DO, and some communities don't. And so that community forms, and really kind of that's what makes that meatball. But if we have high DO, what ends up happening is you kind of get one population. Because if you have high DO, then even in the middle of the granule, in the middle of the flock, it's still high DO. So there's nowhere for bacteria that don't like high DO to go kind of get in that to get in that middle. When I talk about high DO, they're talking about like 5 mg/L. They're not talking 3, they're talking 5. So they're talking really high DO. Um, Denitrification in the sludge blanket, that's going to cause floating, but it's not going to cause pin flock. And if you generally see the floating, what it is, it's like a big blob that comes up. Now, when that blob falls apart, maybe there's some pin flock there. But generally, denitrification isn't going to cause it. I would say filaments actually help pin flock. Why would filaments help pin flock?
It brings it down.
Yeah,
It
think
settles.
about filaments. If you ever look at that stalk ciliate, that stalk ciliate is capturing pin flock. So some level of filament, I've always said a low level of filaments is actually a little bit helpful. It helps you sweep out pin flock. Now you got to be really careful because a high level of filaments is really bad. So it's like you're playing with fire if you're saying I want a little bit of filaments, but they do help have high effluent TSS, or sorry, low effluent TSS because they sweep out pin flock. Anaerobic conditions in your aeration basin. Basically, if you start having anaerobic conditions, you're not aerating it, and you're starting to decay. You're starting to go septic, and your flock is falling apart. And then toxic shock load. I would say generally most plants don't have toxic shock loads. But what ends up happening when you have it is basically your bacteria are for one reason or another, they're either getting killed or they can't get food enough to grow. And so what they start to do is they don't want to be in a flock anymore. They start to basically go out on their own to try to get food and survive. Um, and I think various plants at TRA have had instances of toxic shock loads. It doesn't happen once a year. It probably happens once every 5 to 10 years. And usually when it happens, it's a big deal. But it's not something I would jump to other causes before I jump to a toxic shock. Um, so let's keep going. We'll go to the next question now. Looks like not Don Cheadle's not doing very well. Um, all right, so we got the next question here. I have pin blocks going over my clarifier weirs. What are some of the things I could do to alleviate that? All right, looks like most of you got the answers correct. I think the hardest one on this one is the overoxidized sludge, and increasing, wasting, decreasing SRT. And it was largely because I think I led you a little bit astray on overoxidized sludge. So what are they talking about here when they're saying increase wasting or decrease SRT?
I'm still allergic to it. Okay.
Lower your inventory.
Lower your inventory, because basically what's happened is you're carrying too much inventory. If you carry too much inventory, you're starting to decay your bugs, right? And your bugs are eating each other. And it's becoming like over oxidized. And over, it's kind of an interesting term, but essentially you have too much inventory, and you're basically becoming kind of like an aerobic digester. So you have too much decay. So I'm going to keep us moving so we can get through the next quiz. We're going to join one more session. Sorry to join sessions. We have to keep rejoining sessions because we can only have so many questions. Otherwise, we have to pay the fee. So maybe eventually, if this works out, maybe we'll pay the fee, but see if we can get people going here and then we'll get started. So this next one is, I have dark tan foam in my basins that cannot be broken up by sprays. Looks like we have 6 of 8. We have all 8 here. We're gonna go ahead and get started.
It's not done, you know, but all that stuff wrong.
What is the probable cause here?
To use this thing, so it's- yeah, use the- use the- just-
All right, everyone's answered. And looks like most people got the answer, right? There is only one answer here, and it's SRT is too long. So essentially, you're carrying too much inventory. You're having a bunch of junk start to go to the top of your basin. A brown sludge is really associated with an old sludge. Does anybody know what if I have a white foam? What's a white foam associated with?
The cardia.
Nocardia would be a brown foam, yeah.
Oh,
You need to return more.
oh, that's too young.
A white foam is too young. Yeah, a white foam means like if you ever go through a startup of a new basin that you took offline and you start up the new basin, you're gonna have some white foam. It doesn't last very long, but it's definitely a white foam and it's very distinct. The one that's not on here that I think it's, what the EPA didn't identify was nocardia and fog. To me, nocardia should be on here for a tan foam because if you end up having fats, oils, and grease come into your plant, you can have nocardia growth, and that'll make a brown foam on top of your aeration basins too. So that one's not in here from the EPA manual, but we've added it in our slides. I think it should be in there. But the SRT being too long is one of the other ones. I'm going to move to the next question now because it's um, about how to correct it. It looks like a lot of you got that one right fairly quickly. SRT is too long, so what should I do? I'm hoping people answer this one pretty quick. We'll see if Kanye West knows how to do it.
No, I'm not really Don Shield won the first round, not Don Shield lost the second one, so Don Shield get back. Just take over for a little bit.
All right, everyone's answered. I'm hoping for 100%. We got Kanye West as who I'm going to guess that decreased wasting. So
Yeah.
if our SRT is too long, we need to increase wasting, right? Sorry, Ray, I cut you off.
I pressed the wrong button. Yeah, I'm sorry. I was looking at it. I was like, oh man, I pushed it up too quick. I'm sorry.
No, you're
Okay,
good.
I got it. I got it. Yeah.
That makes me feel better that somebody didn't think it was decreased wasting. It was just a fat fingered
I
answer.
know. I tried to change it, but I couldn't.
Yeah, I think once you submit it, I think you're done. Don Cheadle won. So we're gonna move to our last question here. This one should be, you have to join another session. I apologize. Last session. Maybe another 3 to 5 minutes and we'll be done with today's training. All right, looks like we have all 8 people here. Are you guys ready? So the question is, my sludge blanket is overflowing over the secondary clarifier weirs uniformly. And pick up on the words there. They're using certain words specifically. This one, I think some of you are going to get. Wow. Okay, I didn't expect the whole range here. All right, so I'm going to go through and talk about each one of these. So I disagree with some of these, and I'll tell you why. Inadequate RAS rate is right. What, I mean, if you have inadequate RAS rate, it goes along with solids loading rate on the far right, right? So if I'm putting in the example I used last time, if I have an aeration basin that has 5 mgd and 4,000 milligrams per liter coming out of it, I can calculate the pounds coming into the clarifier. And if I can't withdraw that much of my RAS, then I'm overloading it from the solids, or my RAS rate isn't, I can't get my RAS rate high enough. So it can be either one. So those two are correct answers. Peak flows, overloading the clarifier, again, same thing. If you have peak flows, that means you have high solids loading rate. Those two are kind of the same thing. You're putting a lot of flow and a lot of solids in your clarifier, and your RAS can't get up there. The one I'm disagreeing with, and it's because the way the question is phrased, it says unequal flow distribution. You don't have unequal flow distribution because it says your secondary clarifier weirs are overflowing uniformly. So that's why I'm disagreeing with the question. So I'm disagreeing with Caitlin here. But you could, so one thing could be unequal flow distribution could be that I know Ray's on the phone at 10 Mile. If they have two aeration basins that have splitter structures that split to the aeration basins, and we've looked at the splitter structure and we don't think it's splitting right. And so you could be overflowing one side and overloading that one clarifier in that case. So I could see how that's the right answer. But the way that the question is phrased with weirs uniformly, that tells me my weirs are level and I don't have unequal flow distribution. But SRT too short, that should keep you low inventory, so that should help. And then too much settling area is a good thing. That means you have more settling area, you can get a thinner blanket. So let's go to the next part here. We're going to go to the last question of the morning. This is kind of aligning with what to do here, with what the answers are. I've kind of alluded to it a little bit, maybe giving you some of the answers. All right, here we go. Looks like we have 100% getting it right. So good work. I may have given you the answers in the previous one, but I think I don't think I'm going to talk I think we talked about it a little bit already. So in the kind of understanding where we're at in time, is there any questions or comments about any of the quiz answers or concepts we went over today? I'll go to we'll see who won, I guess. It's like Daniel won with Chris in second and Don Cheeto in third. Any questions or comments? I guess I'll end with, I thank you all for getting on your phone and actually participating. What we wanted to make sure is that sometimes people don't have mics. Sometimes people don't want to speak up. So hopefully this forum gives us a better way to make sure everybody's kind of engaged and thinking about the answers. So thanks for your time today, and we'll keep kind of working through the sessions, and again, it'll be available as recorded. So the recording should be available if you missed it or you want to go over it and see it again. We'll also have all of the EPA guidelines. So I'll bring the slides up quick. There it is. So in the slide deck we'll deliver, you will see the kind of the EPA guidelines for activated sludge troubleshooting. You'll see those at the end of the slide deck. They have different things for secondary clarifiers. They talk about following of the weirs. They talk about causes and checks and monitors. So all this will be delivered with the slide deck. And future quizzes will probably incorporate more and more of these as we go through it. And we'll probably talk less about them and maybe just keep quizzing you on it. So, but yeah, thanks again for joining, and we'll see you again, and send any questions if you have them. So.
Okay. Pretty
Thank
good
you,
training.
Eric.
Man. Really
Yep,
good.
have a good rest of your morning. Bye.